if we were to do the back side like this one is done, where I just went down to the center and continued on doing increases and built this other side of my beadwork out, you would see that we would be closing off the center into the tubular form. And we would have no way of encasing a beautiful rivoli or any type of stone or anything inside of it. So in order for this to work out, we're going to have to create the back separately, and then we will zip the two pieces together, just like this. Now on the back side of this project, once I create a duplicate of this, exact same piece of beadwork. Then I'm going to sew down into the center and show you guys how to use the decrease form of circular peyote to fill in the back. Now if you'll notice, there's a couple of little divots right here on the back side of this beadwork. And what those are were once I went to zip in my stone and I got everything all closed up in there, I came back through and I sewed down through my beadwork here to firmly secure that stone in place so it cannot move around inside of its little frame here, or its little beaded bezel. And it came out looking really, really good. So now I'm going to show you guys how to sew in the back of this project. So here we are, and we are exiting from the gold bead at the top of one of our corners here, the very first corner we started from. And now, if you're familiar with peyote, you know that when you move through peyote, you normally have to sew down on a diagonal. But because we're here at the corner, I'm going to take my needle, and I'm going to sew down through all of these gold beads right here along this edge of my corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then I'm going to also sew this through this first delica right there. So if you can get it in one pass, that's awesome. If you can't get it all, the needle through everything in one pass, you can work in multiple passes. I'm going to try to get mine through here in one pass. And so I'm going through all of those beads, but before I pull that needle through, I'm going to flip this work over and make sure that I hit through all of the beads so that I don't have a big old exposed thread showing when I get down here. Now I can go ahead and pull that thread all the way through. And I'm ready to begin closing up the back of this beadwork. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bead, I'm going to peyote through these beads here in the center. So I'm going to put a bead, 1, 2, 3 beads. And when I get to the corner, I'll be exiting that last bead. So just pick up your little peyote bead and sew through the next one sticking out. And if it helps, you can kind of flip the beadwork is naturally shaped itself. It's kind of domed out here down at the long tip. So if you need to, you can bend this outward just a little bit so that you can get your beads in place. And once again, you want to be really careful that you don't pierce your working thread or that you don't wind up going under a thread bridge and have a bead twisting around on you in there. So take your time and work over to the first corner. So I'm putting my last bead in place. You can see it's a little difficult to get the needle in. So that's why I'm just going to take my time because I really don't want to make a mistake this far into the project. All right, so here we are at the first corner. What we're going to do is we're going to do a decrease. So instead of picking up a bead here, we're simply going to skip over into the sticking out delica on our next side, right there on the other side of the corner. So here's my working thread, exiting this bead. I'm going to sew through that very next delica sticking out. And that's going to put me sewing down the first long side. So now I'm just going to repeat the peyote and put a bronze bead in between every one of my sticking out bronze beads along this side. And once again, you want to make sure you don't get your thread hung up on the outside edge of your beadwork. Double check that occasionally just to make sure, so if you were to make a mistake, you don't have to back your work out too far. It helps to just hold your thumb there at the corner, and it keeps that thread from being able to get hung up down here. So I've added my delica beads down the first long side, and here I am, and I'm exiting from the last bronze delica on this side. I'm simply going to sew across the beadwork into the first delica on the other long side. Pull that thread through, and that is our decrease. So now that I've done my decrease down here at this long corner, the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to zip this corner down here closed. I am exiting from this lower bead here on the right. I'm going to take my needle and sew through the next bead sticking up on the left-hand side. And they look like little zipper teeth. So that's how you can tell which ones to pull together. So I'm going to pull these two together, just like that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten up that bead. So here is the bead that I just stitched up through and I'm exiting from the top of. But you can see it's a little bit loose because that was my last bead added. So to tighten this bead up, I am going to sew down from top to bottom through the bead right beside of it. Right there. And I'm going to square stitch those two beads together. Make sure your thread doesn't get hung up on the corner of the beadwork. Pull it through. Then I'm going to come right back up through that same bead that I was exiting to begin with. And I'm going to pull that through, and I'm going to snug those beads in nice and tight right beside each other. So now I want to bring this bead to this side of the beadwork. So here I am exiting from this bead right here. I'm going to go up the next bead on the opposite side, sticking out. And I'm going to pull that together. So now when I pull it in, it's going to bring those two beads to sit nestled in beside each other. But I want to tighten that bead up as well. So this time I'm going to square stitch backwards two beads. I'm exiting from this C bead right here. I'm going to find the bead right next to it. I'm going to come down through that bead and one below it on the diagonal. So I'm coming through those two beads towards the center of the point. I'm going to pull that all the way through. Now I can come back up through that bead that I'm trying to position in the center, right here. Back to the to the left, I'm sorry. I'm going to pull that through, and that's going to tighten that bead up. And now all of that looks closed much more professionally. What I want to determine is if you need to put a bead in between this next section. So if I try to push my sides together, you see I have space for one more bead in here. I'm going to have a bead right in here to stitch to this bead on the opposite side. Because I'm exiting that center bead, I can just take one of my delicas and I'm going to sew up through that next delica sticking out here on the left. And I'm going to pull that bead into position. So now that's going to fill the gap, and I can stitch this bead over to this bead. Now I can choose to do that now, but I think what I'm going to do is work my way around. So I'm going to go ahead and add my delicas and do my decreases on this side of the beadwork. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep stitching forward, putting in my delicas. Up to this next corner. And when I reach the corner, which I'm adding my last delica in the corner, I am going to do another decrease, so I'm going to sew straight across to that delica sticking out right there. Here on the short side of the triangle. Without picking up, I'm just bringing that close like that. Now I can see right here that I'm going to need at least one more bead in between those two delicas, so I'm going to put one there. So I'm working on the short side of the triangle now, which is where I have the widest open area, so it's safe to put a bead in. But you're going to have to try to use your judgment on this particular decreasing technique. So here I am, and I'm at the corner again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew through that next delica sticking out on the other long side without picking up. I'm decreasing the beadwork in that corner. So now I'm going to work my way back down towards this area where I'm actually really having to close up my beadwork. So I'm going to put a delicate in. I'm going to put a couple in. So there's one. And there's two. Let me bring my working thread out of my way here. And now I'm pretty sure I can get one more in there, so I'm going to put that third one in, and then we're going to figure out how to zip closed this next little area. So here we are. And what we want to do is we want to bring this seed bead right here over and connect it to a seed bead here. But I think I have room to fit one more, so I'm going to put one more in. And let's see where that positions my bead. So I'm coming just into that next sticking out delicate and bringing that bead in. So now I'm sitting right beside of the bead that I want to connect. So I could just go up through that center bead to the left without picking up. Then I am going to sew over into the next delicate sticking up on the opposite side, on the right-hand side. And I'm going to pull that nice and snug. And you can see now that we've stitched that together. And we don't have that weird bead sticking out here on the top. And we're ready to move back in the other direction again. If we want to, we can go ahead and straighten this bead up just like we did previously. I'm going to come down through the bead right beside of it on the right. Because you can see it's tilting just a little bit because it was a loose bead. It was the last bead I added. And then I'm going to go straight back up into that bead one more time from the bottom to the top and square stitch those two beads together. And so now that bead sits a lot more nicely. And it looks really good. All right, so now we're going to figure out if we have enough room here for one more bead, which I think we can just go ahead and zip this bead into this bead. So I'm going to cross over on the next bead sticking up back on the left again. And I'm going to pull that through. Well, actually, let me backtrack. I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to come back out. Be careful when you come out. You don't want to pierce that thread. All right. So I think I could fit a bead right here and then zip it to that bead when I get back to the opposite side. So I'm going to pick up a seed bead. I'm going to sew through the next one sticking out, and I'm back to sewing counterclockwise again. Because every time I stitch those beads together and do that supreme decrease, I wind up reversing direction. So let's just add our beads. Now we're going to have to start doing some figuring out up here at the top as well, because we're closing all of these gaps. So now I am coming through that corner. I'm at the corner. I'm adding the last bead. I am going to do my decrease, but this time I'm going to have to step up through two. My thread is exiting this bead here. I need to sew through the bead right next to it. But I have an increase there, so I'm going to have to, well, not an increase, but my new row. So I'm going to sew up through that bead as well. So we're sewing up through two on the diagonal. We're going to put one bead in. And at this corner, I only have to sew up through the one bead without picking up. I'm sewing, actually, wait a minute, let me make sure of that. Right, I'm sewing up through this, I'm coming out of that bead. I'm sewing up through the bead right here on the same row without picking up, and I'm going to pull those beads in. So you can see we're almost got this whole thing closed up. So now my biggest gap is here. I know from experience that I need to add a bead there. And then I'm going to see that I need to add one more bead right here, because my gap is still pretty big. So I'm going to add that bead. And now I can zip this part closed. Actually, I think I need one more bead. I'm going to add one last bead. And now I'm going to zipper up through the next two beads on the right. So I'm going to come through that bead and the bead right above it on the diagonal. I am going to pass down through that new bead I just added. Then I am going to come back up through the bead right beside of it on the left, on the right, plus the next bead, because that's the sticking up bead. And I don't want to pass over that thread. I want to pass under that thread. So this is a little tricky right here. Let's do it one bead at a time. We're going to come up through the bead right beside it. Exiting here, sewing up through here. I'm going to pull that good and tight to get that existing thread out of my way. Now I'm going to sew up through that next bead sticking up. Still on the right hand side. Now when I pull this together, we can see that I can actually zip up through this next bead on the left. So I'm going to come up through that left bead sticking out. Now I'm going to zip up through the bead on the right, the next one sticking out on the right. And I could go back and pull this bead out, but I'm just going to leave it because basically it's not that noticeable. And it really is kind of hard to judge this, but you can, if you feel like going back and taking that one bead out, you can do that. I'm going to leave it where it sits, and I'm going to continue on closing up this beadwork. So if I pull my thread over, you can see that I've got a really big hole right there. So I need to add another bead or two before I finish. So what I'm going to do, I'm in position to add another bead. I'm exiting a bead that is sticking out. So I can add one more bead right here. And I'm going to go ahead and sew through that next delicate poking out. And then I'm going to decrease again here at this corner. So I'm going to have to step up through the bead right beside the one I'm exiting, plus the next one on the next row. So I'm exiting a sticking out bead. And now I'm at my other short side corner. I can just step up through the bead sticking out here, because it is the one right beside the one I'm exiting. And I'm going to pull that closed. I need to add one more delica right here. So I'm exiting this bead that's sticking out. I'm picking up a delica and going through that next sticking out bead. Now I'm ready just to close this beadwork straight up. Here I am exiting this bead. I'm going to sew through the bead straight across, and I'm going to step up through two beads so that I'm exiting the top bead in the center on the diagonal. Then I am just going to sew through the bead sticking out on my short side row. And then I am going to sew through the two beads The one right beside the one I'm exiting and the one above it on the diagonal. And there we have created our closed back. So that when we put our little rivoli in, it sits right in that little dip right here. Then when we sew our top together, it will secure this stone in place. To end this thread, I need to stitch this bead to this bead. So I'm going to have to step up through, go through the bead beside of it and the one above it once again. And I'm really going to secure this very inner section here. Now I can sew through I'm exiting this bead. I'm going to sew through the next bead that's directly across from it, right there. And I am just stitching all of these beads together and making sure that I don't have any loose spots. So now I can come up through the bead right beside of it on the right-hand side. And I'm going to pull really, really tight. And then I am going to end this thread. So the easiest way to end this thread, I'm exiting from this bead, so I'm going to sew on the diagonal up to my gold beads. So I'm coming through those next 3 bronze on the diagonal. And it just so happens to position me directly below my line of gold accent beads here on this corner. So I'm going to sew up through some of those beads, and I think I made it through all 4, double checking to make sure I don't have any exposed thread. And now I'm at the corner, and I can begin to stitch my 2 pieces together so we can set our stone. So here's a little trade secret. Because I have already made my front piece, I just went ahead and filled this one in. So this is actually the piece where I had the 7 rows. I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to make a front piece. My front piece is only going to have 6 rows because like I said, I used the same piece so I could continue on with the video. But when we get to the part of closing the beadwork up, it's going to be exactly the same instructions. So don't worry about the fact that mine might look just a little bit different. We're going to follow the exact same technique.